Anything else relating to, for instance, like a change of use to an HMO, it is 10 years. That's very important to know. And that means that you've got to be, if you're going down the certificate route, you need to have such clear evidence, a clear history of evidence that you need to show to the council, so that when you pop your head up and submit an application for a certificate, everything's in place. Because if you apply for a certificate and you get it wrong and you get it refused, it's highly likely that you're going to get enforcement action, and that's when you have to get rid of the use, revert it to back to what its old planning use was and what it should be, and then you're out of pocket. So HMOs are good for two reasons. One is related to planning and one is related to the people that use them. So in planning terms, HMOs offer a kind of flexible, affordable form of living for people within the area, particularly in places like London or areas that are very high value, where the rental prices for a normal AST are really, really high. HMOs give you that flexibility to have people stay for a limited amount of time, but also the rent levels are much lower, meaning that the barrier to entry for a good standard of accommodation is a lot lower. And obviously on the flip side, for investors, they offer a high yield and they can be very profitable if kind of managed correctly. And the balance between planning and investors and how they understand the whole process with HMOs is kind of fine balance. I've been a planning officer in my time. I've also advised people on getting permission for HMOs. And a lot of kind of mistakes are made, and this video is kind of a snapshot of all the kind of options open to you for getting an HMO, because maybe you're in a situation where you've bought a property and it is an HMO but you don't have planning proof for that and you want to do that, or maybe you have a property, you have an idea that you want to turn it into an HMO. There are options for you to do that. A really important context to HMOs that can be a kind of deciding factor for most people that would want to get into an HMO, particularly when it comes to planning, is the size of the HMO. The size of the HMO does give it a different use class depending on its size. So there are two different types of use classes for HMOs. One is C4 and the other one is sui generis. C4 is essentially a form of residential, and sui generis is a term used in planning that basically means it's its own use class. It's not got its own definition, so a whole bunch of types of uses are thrown into sui generis, and HMOs, large HMOs, fall into that. So C4 is for a small HMO, and that's for people. That's for up to 6 residents in one property. So up to 6, obviously with shared amenities. If it was a house with 6 people in it as a family, that would just be a single dwelling house. So that's different. It's 6 unrelated people that share amenities, and that's up to 6. So that's C4. Anything above that, 7 plus, that falls into sui generis. And as I'll go through in a minute, that has ramifications in terms of its the planning issues in its context and the likely chance of getting success if you do want to get a large HMO, say. So the first and most obvious option open to you is to go for full planning permission. And there are kind of 2 scenarios where you would want to use this. The first is if you have a small HMO, you do benefit from permitted development rights, as I'll get onto in a minute, but you may need to apply for full planning permission if there is an Article 4 direction in place. Now, I've done videos on what an Article 4 direction is, but effectively what it does is it removes certain permitted development rights within a certain area. So a council will draw an area and say, we want to prevent this particular permitted development right from happening, and as a result it means that if you want to exercise that right, you'll need to apply for planning permission for it. So that's a key distinction. So if you're looking for a C4 HMO, so that's up to 6 people, and there's an Article 4 direction in place, then you'll need to apply for planning permission if there's an Article 4 direction in place. Then, once you apply for planning permission, you'll then need to refer to all the policies. Now, generally speaking, if an Article 4 direction is in place on things like HMOs, it does make it difficult to get planning permission for it, because what they're trying to do is councils are always trying to balance the mix of communities and the mix of units in place. So they want some private, they want some affordable, they want some of shared amenities like HMOs. But if there's they feel like an issue is brewing in an area where there's going to be a really high density of HMOs that's effectively going to affect the mix of the local area, and suddenly they're going to get an influx of loads of certificates for HMOs, then that's when they put it in place. So all of these things need to be approved by the government. Article 4 directions aren't just put in place by whoever they want, whenever they want. They have to apply to the government to get these Article 4 directions in place, so they're not a given. So that basically means the Article 4 directions are assessed. They are assessed by someone else, the government, to assess whether that's acceptable. So that's why they're in place, and that's why you will need to go for full planning permission. The second scenario of needing to go for full planning permission is if you need to go for a sui generis, so a large HMO. A large HMO doesn't benefit from any permitted development rights. So again, the same issues apply for a small HMO as opposed to a large HMO because of the because there are no permitted development rights, so you need to apply for planning permission. And when it comes to applying for planning permission for an HMO, there are a couple of key issues that are kind of blanket across them all. The first is principle. The principle is always the place to start. The principle of an HMO being acceptable here. Now, if it's very likely that a council will have a policy on HMOs, and in there is likely to be detail on. A lot of councils have kind of density policies on HMOs, which basically says something along the lines of, if there's so many HMOs within this 100-metre radius, this is as many as we allow. If there's any applications for any more, we're going to refuse it. There's no more capacity for it. Obviously, if there's fewer than that, then you have scope to get permission for an HMO. So that's the principle. You have to understand the policies around HMOs and what they say. It's a very simple thing to do. You just need to look at the local plan's policies, find their policy on HMO, and just see what it says. It may also refer to guidance that can kind of guide you along. The second issue is normally a lot of councils have issues with the amount of traffic movements that come with HMOs. So because it's unrelated people, it's not like a family share a car. Where there's only going to be one car on site. So HMOs, again, depending on what council you're in and what the issues are, they may have issues with the amount of traffic movements and comings and goings, and how that affects the kind of vibrancy and the amenity of the area. So that can be a stumbling block. And the last issue is really kind of a technical point, and you've got to make sure that the room sizes are the correct size. There is guidance on what room sizes you need to provide for an HMO. So don't just assume that you can get an HMO, make a room really small, share amenities so you can get more people in there. There are certain room sizes that you need to meet, so you'll need to check the guidance for that. So those are the key issues. So the second option available to you is to apply for a certificate of lawfulness. This can be tricky, very tricky, if you don't have the right evidence in place. But it can be done. So the issues relating to a certificate of lawfulness are, so there's one thing that needs to be cleared up. One is that a lot of people say that or think that certificate of lawfulness, you need to provide evidence of 4 years. That is only true of residential properties. So if you want to change something to residential, or if you're making alterations to a residential property currently at the time of this recording, it is 4 years, so you need to provide evidence of 4 years. Anything else relating to, for instance, like a change of use to an HMO, it is 10 years. That's very important to know. And that means that you've got to be, if you're going down the certificate route, you need to have such clear evidence, a clear history of evidence that you need to show to the council, so that when you pop your head up and submit an application for a certificate, everything's in place. Because if you apply for a certificate and you get it wrong, and you get it refused, it's highly likely that you're going to get enforcement action, and that's when you have to get rid of the use, revert it to back to what its old planning use was, what it should be, and then you're out of pocket and you're in in potentially hot water. So when you use the certificate route, you really have to make sure that you've got all the information in place. So what does the information look like? It looks like things like all the contracts, the history of the tenancy of that HMO. So if you've got evidence of 10 years, every single tenant for every room for 10 years, that's very compelling evidence. Other things are like tax bills, licensing. If you've got a license for the HMO, that's not on its own enough, but that's good evidence to show that it's been a licensed HMO. Details of the people that have lived there, their utility bills, their tax bills, their TV bills, council tax records, also their voting records. Are they registered to vote? What's their address? Can you prove that? So all these things, but it has to be clear and compelling for 10 years, and it has to prove without doubt that what you're saying is true. Because effectively what you've got to show, and there's got to be no evidence out there that a planning officer can find that is going to go against what you're saying. If they do, so if you submit all of your, if you say, yeah, I've got the council tax records for every room for 10 years, but if you can't prove the tenancy records, or if the council finds something else to the contrary, then it could be refused. So you need to make sure that all the information you have is very, very clear. It's very important if you're going to go down the certificate route. Lastly, the option you have is going for permitted development. Now this only relates to changing use from C3, which is residential, to C4, which, as I said before, is a small HMO, and only if there is no Article 4 direction in place. You can flip-flop between the two, so you can go from C3 to C4, so that's a house to a small HMO, or a small HMO to a house, and vice versa. You can do all that. That's fine. Just make sure there's no Article 4 direction in place, and then you can benefit from permitted development rights. And it's quite a simple application process. You won't have any negotiations with the council. You won't need to provide evidence. You won't need to comply with planning policies. It's a right, so it's your right to exercise if all the right conditions are in place that allow you to benefit from that. So that's how you get planning permission for an HMO. If there's anything I've said that you want me to expand more on, or if there's a kind of situation, there's always situations in planning that are different, that aren't kind of boilerplate. So if there's a situation that you've got and you've used this strategy, please share it so people can learn as well. And otherwise, I'll see you on the next video.